There is a place in northern Maine where you can paddle a canoe for the better part of a day, tie it off on a quiet shore, walk up through the spruce, and come face to face with two full-size steam locomotives. Not models, not a museum piece behind a rope, cold iron as heavy as a house, standing on a short length of rail in a forest with no road to it, no town, no station, no track leading in or out. The rails run a few dozen feet and stop in the grass at the edge of the trees. The driving wheels come up past your shoulder. The boilers are streaked with the better part of a century of rust, and they are pointed patiently at a lake, as if they are still waiting for a load that was due sometime in 1933. Somebody brought these here. That is the part that will not sit still in your mind. You are standing in one of the emptiest corners of the eastern United States, looking at machines that weigh as much as a house, and the only honest question is the one this whole channel is built on. Why are these here? And once you know how hard it was to put them here, a colder question takes its place. Why would anyone leave them? To understand the engines, you have to understand a quarrel with a map. The country up here is the Allagash, lakes and slow rivers in the far north of Maine, hard against the Canadian line. It is beautiful, and for a paper company in the 1920s, it was maddening because of one stubborn fact of geography. The water here runs the wrong way. The Allagash drains north toward the St. John River and into Canada. But the mills that wanted this wood sat to the south at Millinocket on the Penobscot. Wood floats downstream. That is how you moved it cheaply for a century. You cut it, you rolled it into the water, and you let the river carry it to the mill. But a river only flows one direction, and this one flowed away from everywhere the wood needed to go. In the mid-1920s, a logging contractor named Edouard Lacroix, a Quebecois operator big enough that men called him king, signed a deal with the Great Northern Paper Company to move pulpwood out of this country by the 100,000 cords a year. The cutting was never the hard part. Crossing the divide was. Between the north-flowing water and the south-flowing water, there is a low spine of land, and everything depended on getting the wood over it. So Lacroix decided to build a railroad, 13 miles of standard gauge track, the same width as the main lines that crossed the country, from Eagle Lake in the north-flowing basin to Umbazookskus Lake in the south-flowing one. 13 miles to lift a forest over the height of land and drop it into water that finally ran toward the mill. Hold on to the shape of that bargain, because everything that follows lives inside it. To beat the map, you have to haul an entire railroad into a place with no road. And that math only works. The effort is only worth it if the wood never stops coming. This is a wager that pays only as long as it never ends. There had been an earlier attempt to argue with this same piece of ground. Back around the turn of the century, a cable tramway ran across the neck between the lakes. A loop of steel cable, hauled by steam, dragging log cars a few thousand feet from one basin toward the other. It worked in its way for about 5 years, and then a better machine came along and it was done. The woods up here already had a habit, you could say, of swallowing the last clever solution the moment the next one arrived. Nobody standing there in 1926 seems to have read it as a warning, because what Lacroix and Great Northern did next was not modest. They did not build a little woods tram. They brought in a real railroad, and to do it, they had to carry the whole thing in over the snow. Picture that winter, 1926 into 1927, there are no roads. So everything moves on sleds, dragged by Lombard log haulers, squat tracked steam tractors, the ancestors of every bulldozer you have ever seen, creeping across frozen lakes and iced over tote roads, staged out of Lac Frontière on the Quebec border and inland to Eagle Lake. They hauled the rails. They hauled the timbers for a 1,500-foot trestle out across the north end of Chamberlain Lake. They hauled 2 gasoline switchers and 45 freight cars, and they hauled, on skids across the ice, the heaviest thing of all, a steam locomotive. Think about the nerve of that. You are dragging a full-size engine across a frozen lake in the dark of a Maine winter on the bet that the ice holds and the wood keeps coming. That first engine was old already, bought second-hand off an American mainline, built at Schenectady back in 1897, a machine that had spent a working life pulling freight somewhere with a timetable and a town at each end. And up here it turned out to be too worn to do the job. Its condition limited how long a train it could pull. So the next year, in the spring of 1928, they brought in a second one, a heavier consolidation type from the Brooks Works, built in 1901, and that engine became the workhorse, strong enough to drag 15 loaded cars at a time over the divide and back in about 3 hours. Both had been cut off from the world they were built for. Both burned oil, not coal. And that detail is quietly telling because coal throws cinders, and cinders start forest fires. And a fire here would burn the very thing the whole operation existed to cut. Even the engines had to be kept from threatening the forest that fed them. Every drop of that oil was itself hauled in over the ice each winter into a row of tanks on the lakeshore. And then this improbable thing worked beautifully. Along the Eagle Lake shore, they built conveyors that reached down into the water, caught the floating logs, and lifted them 25 feet up into the rail cars. Here's the rhythm of it, and it is worth standing inside for a moment. A car rolls into place under the loader. The conveyor bites into the floating wood and starts lifting, 12 cords of it, a car's whole belly, climbing out of the lake and into the steel. 18 minutes, and that car is full and rolling south, and the next one is already sliding in behind it. Day and night, barely a pause. In an average week, something like 6,500 cords of pulpwood crossed the height of land and went to the mill, enough by the reported scale of Great Northern's output to feed something like a fifth of all the paper made in America that year. For a few years in a place with no road, 2 old engines beat the map every single day. Here's where you have to slow down and look at what nobody, at the time, thought to write down as a decision at all. Because the strange thing about this railroad is that it did not fail. We are used to abandoned things being failures. The mine that flooded, the town that dried up, the bridge that fell. This was the opposite. This railroad did exactly what it was built to do, and it did it about as well as anyone could have asked. Over its working life, it carried something close to 1 million cords of wood over that divide. The engines held, the ice had held. The wager on its own terms came in. What broke was not the machine, it was the reason. By the early 1930s, the Great Depression had reached into the paper trade and pulled the floor out. Newsprint demand fell. A mill that once could not get enough wood suddenly had more than it could use, and the entire towering effort up in the Allagash, the sleds across the ice, the trestle, the conveyors, the 2 engines running through the night, rested, remember, on a single condition. It was only ever worth it if the wood never stopped. In 1933, the wood stopped. There was no crash, no disaster, no last dramatic run. The record does not hand us a final whistle or a man locking a door for the last time. It hands us something quieter and, in a way, worse. A transfer of pulpwood that simply ceases, in a year when a great many things quietly ceased. The trains were not needed that season, and no season after it ever needed them again. Nobody, it turned out, was coming back. Now, you might think the engines stayed because everyone forgot them, or because there was some mystery about it. There was not. The reason they are still standing in that forest is almost insulting in its plainness, and it is the whole point. When the operation shut down, those 2 locomotives were already old. They had been second-hand when they arrived. And getting them out was the same problem as getting them in. Run backwards. No road, no connecting track. 13 miles of wilderness between them and anywhere a train could actually go. To haul them out, you would have to do the whole winter miracle again. Sleds, tractors, ice, crews, months. For 2 obsolete engines that no one by then particularly wanted. And when wood hauling finally did return to this country, years later, it came on trucks. And a truck needs no 13 miles of track dragged across a frozen lake. There was never again a reason to move them. So somebody did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said the machines were worth less than the cost of bringing them home. Sit with that sentence, because it is the one that turns this from a railroad story into something else. These engines were not left behind because they were broken or beaten or useless. They were left behind because they had done their work. And the moment the work was over, moving them cost more than they were worth. The same effort that was gladly spent to drag them in could not be justified to drag them out. Coming was an investment. Leaving was just a cost. And here's the turn, that the thing you can only see standing in that clearing almost 100 years later. Look at which side of the divide they are stranded on. They sit up at the Eagle Lake end, the north flowing side, the wrong side, the side the whole railroad was built to lift the wood up and out of. Those engines spent years dragging a forest over the height of land, beating the direction of the water every single day. And when the money stopped, they were left sitting on the losing side of the very divide they conquered. The water they defeated still runs north, past them toward Canada, exactly as it always did. They won every day for as long as someone was paying them to win. The map just had to wait. I said at the start that the first question is, why are these here? But that is not really the question that keeps people standing in front of them longer than they meant to. We build things for a reason, a railroad, a mill. A whole working life poured into some purpose that felt, at the time, permanent. The wood will always come, the demand will always be there, we will always be needed for this. And the hard, quiet truth these engines carry is that the reason almost always dies first. The structure outlives the purpose, the effort outlives the need for it. There is a particular arithmetic that anyone who has worked a long time comes to recognize. It is the moment a thing you gave everything to decides, without malice, that you are now worth less than the cost of keeping you. That the cheapest thing to do is simply to leave you where you stopped. It is not cruelty. It is just a number. These two engines are that number, made of iron standing in the woods, and people will not leave them alone. That is the part I keep coming back to. The shed that sheltered the engines burned in 1969, and the fire took the wooden cab off the older locomotive. Souvenir hunters carried away what they could pry loose. In the 1990s, crews came in just to strip the asbestos out of them. And in 2012, a group of volunteers hauled tools into the wilderness by boat, jacked the two hulks up out of the ground where they had begun to sink, and set them back squarely on their rails, for no practical reason at all, because there is no practical reason left. Nobody does that for a machine. They do it for what the machine has become. Because walk up to them, and the feeling is not really pity. Tens of tons of iron apiece, and they refuse to disappear. The weather has had 90-odd winters at the steel, and they are still there upright, enormous, unmistakably what they were, holding the exact shape of the work they were built for, pointed at a lake, waiting for a train of logs that is never going to come. So you paddle back out. You leave them the way everyone has left them, because there is nothing else to do. They were too heavy to bring home in 1933, and they are heavier now. But something stays with you on the water. It is not really about trains. It is the thing you saw in them and could not unsee. That we will move almost anything, spend almost anything, to put a machine or a person exactly where the work is. And that the work is always the first thing to end. That being finished with is not the same as failing. And that a thing can stand for the better part of a century, perfectly intact, doing nothing but remembering what it was for. On the wrong side of a line it once crossed 1,000 times. The rails still run their few dozen feet into the grass and stop. The water still runs north, and the engines still wait, patient as the ground they were dragged across, worth in the end less than the trip home, and somehow still refusing to be gone.